Good morning. I'm Christy Kavlik, an Associate Division Director in the Research to Practice Division on the Early Childhood team. And I have the pleasure to introduce this session today. This is a session at OSEP that we really look forward to. It's a time where we bring a long-time IDEA Part D contributor, a friend to OSEP, and a colleague to many of you to come and share perspectives on the field of early intervention and special education. And this year we invited Phil Strain to be our speaker. Phil Strain has a PhD and is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Colorado, Denver, and is director of the Positive Early Learning Experiences Center. He is the author of over 300 professional papers in the early intervention field and has been the principal investigator of grants totaling more than $50 million. He has been recognized with Distinguished Career Awards on 3 separate occasions. Over the past 47 years, he and his colleagues have published numerous long-term outcome studies on children with severe challenging behaviors served in the Regional Intervention Program, which culminated in a 25-year follow-up investigation. Dr. Strain has authored the original grant that funded the development of the LEAP program, an inclusive preschool model for young children with autism. He conducted the largest randomized controlled trial of the LEAP program to date and recently completed a long-term follow-up on the participants from the randomized controlled trial. Dr. Strain's current work focuses on strategies to help states sustain the use of evidence-based practices, field testing manualized approach of parent-centered positive behavioral support, and the program-wide adoption of the pyramid model to address disproportionality in discipline practices in early childhood settings. While at OSEP, I've had this extreme pleasure to work with Phil on a number of projects, including the Technical Assistance Center on Social Emotional Interventions and the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center. From him, I've learned so much about the research on how to support young children's social, emotional, and behavioral competence, how to support children with autism and being included in preschool programs, and particularly on the research around inclusion and the benefits of inclusion for young children both with and without disabilities. Over the years, he has been more than willing to lend support by both providing feedback on documents, providing information and resources to us, and really being there as someone to help think through and problem solve on different issues. Phil is a fabulous storyteller, and he has a great wit, and so I know we're looking forward to the presentation today. I hope I don't steal his thunder by letting you know that he dug through and found transparencies from 30 years ago that he pulled out for this presentation. So I know it's going to be a real treat for you.
Thanks, Christy. You've been a great colleague, and thanks for that nice introduction. So I'm going to move around a little bit because I decided to go drug-free and deal with my ADHD via a lavalier, which allows me to move around a little bit more and not be confined. So here's one thing that I've learned in my 70 years on the planet, and that is that you really can't know from moment to moment and time to time who or what are going to be the significant influences in your life, your personal life or your professional life. They're obvious suspects, right? Your parents, your teachers, your lovers, your friends. But then there are more, for lack of a better term, let's just call them accidental influences. I want to share a couple of those with you this morning. Accidental influences that have had a profound impact on my research and development in early childhood special education. It was about 51 years ago that I was introduced to a fellow named René Descartes. I was in a freshman philosophy course. Now, I had absolutely no interest in philosophy, however. I was interested in Sandy Langston, who I knew was enrolled in this course. So I thought, to increase the probability of social initiations between the two of us, I would participate as well. Alas, probably none of you know, Sandy married my roommate 6 months later. However, I was left with this amazing consolation prize from René Descartes. We should examine most closely the things we hold to be most dear. And if there is a group in special education that might take this as a guidepost for yourself, you're it. That's my invitation to you today, that at some point you should be examining most closely the things you hold to be most dear. The second influence that I want to tell you about occurred a bit later, 1984. I was being beat up pretty badly during the 1980s inclusion wars around kids with autism. I was beat up from both sides. I wasn't inclusive enough, I was too inclusive, and I was complaining to Ted Carr over a couple of Chardonnays in Stony Brook, New York, and Ted said the following: "Being under audience reinforcement control is a dangerous thing." Yeah. Now, admittedly, I wasn't particularly soothed by his humor at the time, and I didn't appreciate the significance of his comment. But a couple of years later, I put René and Ted together, and I realized if you're going to examine most closely the things that you, and especially other people, hold to be most dear, you better grow a thick skin. Thank you, Ted. So, I want to describe for several minutes next a couple of initiatives in my career that have been heavily influenced by the notion of examining most closely and hopefully not falling under audience reinforcement control. My first venture in the field started as a graduate student at Peabody College, and there was an interesting phenomena that had taken place in metropolitan Nashville in the late 1960s. There was a disturbing number of young children below the age of 5 who had been institutionalized in a mental retardation facility, Clover Bottom Hospital and School, bless its heart, because of their early onset challenging behavior. A number of us thought that inexplicable as well as inexcusable at some level. There were all kinds of common solutions to young children with serious challenging behavior in the late 60s. There was less onerous protection or removal of the child from their pathological family. The notion being that only adults who were so pathological could possibly develop in their children such early onset challenging behavior. There was psychiatric treatment, usually provided to mothers, along with what the Stones called mother's little helper, that little yellow pill. And of course, there was mechanical and chemical restraint that was used quite ubiquitously at the time. So in examining most closely the things people held most dear, what did we develop? Well, through the assistance of a model demonstration grant from then Bureau of Education for the Handicapped, we developed something called the Regional Intervention Program. It was begun in 1969. It's alive and well today. in replication sites throughout Tennessee, several states in the US, and for some reason it's become very popular in Latin America. There were a number of key players that I want to highlight, but also suggest to you that literally thousands of people, primarily parents of kids with challenging behavior, are responsible for the success, the long-term success of the RIP program. The original conceptualizer was a clinical psychologist named John Ora, who had struggled with the institutionalization piece that I talked about earlier. My graduate student colleague and long-term, lifelong colleague, Matt Tim, and our supervisor at Peabody College at the time, Ron Wiegerink, who was foolish enough to give us money to go to graduate school as long as we spent 20 hours a week in the RIP program. Well, what were the core features of RIP? What did we do? What did we design? And I would invite you to think about these not just as core features, but as radical features. They were radical in 1969. You might consider whether they're radical, different, out of the norm in 2016 as well. First of all, we eliminated the primary impediment to acquiring services for young children with challenging behavior by obliterating the ticket to get in the first place, be that a diagnosis, a referral, whatever. And we said, if you pick up the phone and say that you need help, you're in. That's the sole ticket for entry into the RIP program. We designed a program where you've got a length of intervention based upon behavior change to criteria. And there were really two. The first was based upon direct observational data of parent-child interaction. Over a 3 to 5 day period, we wanted to see child appropriate behavior, appropriate engagement, positive interaction with parent at least 90% of the time. And we wanted the parent to be using the intervention strategy of choice at least 90% of the time themselves. That was the first kind of set of behavioral criteria. The second was that parents reported to us, they made a verbal report, that the context or the routines at home and in the community that had propelled them to RIP in the first place were now okay. They were satisfied. It was something that they could live with. It was no longer a painful, aversive, stress-inducing situation. The next feature of RIP that was unusual at the time, still unusual today, I would add, is that parents were the sole intervention agents for their own children. And after the program had been in operation for 6 months, the folks coaching new families were all comprised of experienced family members. In fact, after 6 months of operation, experienced family members ran every aspect of the RIP program and have since 1970. You might ask, where are the professionals in this equation? Well, they're around, and they're functioning as resource persons and consultants. If parents run into an issue that they can't solve, then they call on the professional for help. Otherwise, the professionals are out of the picture. The intervention that got delivered is about as simple and straightforward as possible. It was differential reinforcement of good behavior. It was teaching parents to catch their children engaging in appropriate behavior and giving their time and attention to that. And, this sounds easy, plays out really hard, as you'll see in a moment, to systematically not pay attention to challenging behavior. The final component of RIP that I want to share with you today is something called payback as our sustainability strategy. What's that? Well, payback was pretty simple, but it turns out to be the true genius of John Ora. Here's how it worked. If you were served as a family for 4 months in RIP, the invitation was at the end of that 4 months that you give back 4 months to the program, doing a variety of different activities which you could choose from a list of about 4 dozen. And interestingly enough, we were a little surprised by this over time, about 75% of families complete their full payback system. What's particularly important to note is that in our 25-year follow-up study, where we asked the original adult family member to tell us about their RIP experience with that much hindsight, and we asked the question, what was the most important part of your experience in RIP? They uniformly say that payback experience. There's an old saying that turns out to be a true saying, and the old saying is this: if you really want to learn something, if you want something to be a part of your life and to be truly meaningful, you figure out how to teach it to somebody else. And that was their experience. So, who was RIP designed to serve? Let's take a moment and before we get to there, let's do this. I think I'll go ahead and do this. I hope you don't think this is tacky, but, well, actually, I don't care whether you do or not. I'm sorry. My therapist keeps telling me, Phil, you should say the truth more often. You'll be in less trouble. Well, long term, but anyhow. So RIP was not wildly enthusiastically met by the community of practitioners or researchers in the 70s, and John taught us really early to save all your reviews, your grant reviews, your journal reviews, and we've collected stuff forever. Here are just a few highlights. It's irresponsible to put parents in this position, and we'd like to think that was mostly from people who had a fiduciary interest in a different model, but probably not exclusively. It's just another simple-minded behavioral approach. Guilty. Sometimes simple-minded is good. Pretty much all the time behavioral is good if you're talking about kids with significant challenging behavior. And of course, payback will never work. It gave us some great opportunities to practice growing a thicker skin and to not necessarily fall under audience reinforcement control, because we would have stopped doing what we were doing, that's for sure. So, how's this working? Let me suggest to you through video who the children were that we've served. I'm going to talk about some of the outcomes in a moment, and one of the outcomes I want to talk about is from a 25-year follow-up study of RIP clients. And one of the smartest decisions that we made a long time ago was to collect as much video as you could possibly collect and archive it around children as well as around adult family members. And these are videos of some of the kids, some of the 40 individuals who were in the 25-year longitudinal study, which gives you a little bit of flavor for the level and intensity of challenging behavior that we worked with. So take about a minute and a half and take a look.
Hello? You'll speak to Rick? Telephone, Rick. Telephone to you, Rick. Rick, telephone.
Raise your hand if you expected public urination in this keynote. Oh, good. So we've published quite a few studies examining the behavior of adults and children while they're enrolled in RIP. But the real story about early intervention, when you get it right, is changing the trajectory of behavior in the long term. And that's what I want to focus on next, just some of those longitudinal outcomes of RIP. So how do we go about studying this group of kids long term? Hello. So what we do is we track children and find out where they are in their current classroom settings. And then we randomly select 3 to 4 same-gender children. For those children who we select from the classrooms where kids are located, we then do a confirmation to ensure that they have no comparable kinds of problem behavior history. That's our comparison group. And then we've done a variety of direct observational studies. So for example, we've looked at the level of child compliance to teacher requests, to academic requests, to just behavior management kinds of requests. And we find essentially identical levels of compliance to teacher requests when you compare the former RIP clients to their same-gender classroom peers. We found the same sort of level of comparability if we look at the frequency of positive peer interaction that occurs in classroom settings. When we look at special education placement, when we look at rates of adjudicated delinquency, when we look at high school dropout rates, we find that former RIP participants are actually statistically significantly below local norms on all of those measures. You might not have thought so when they were 3, 4, and 5. We went back into our records with the aid of some OSEP funding, and we randomly selected 40 clients who were in a time cohort that permitted a 25-year follow-up study. And we looked at a variety of different measures. We looked at educational attainment, we looked at employment status, we looked at mental health status. Here's what we found in those 40 clients 25 years later. We found that 36 of them had graduated from high school. 32 of them had graduated from college. 40 out of the 40 were in an employment position that was not hourly. They were salaried. They were in essentially career ladder positions, and I think there was one or perhaps two, I can't remember it precisely. I believe it was one of the 40 had a history of significant mental illness in adulthood. That's way below the norm, of the population norm. The other outcome that I'll tell you about real quickly was a cost-benefit analysis that was conducted by researchers from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where they found that the program saved $7 for every one that was spent, and that was within a 3-year time span post-RIP. That was not considering those 25-year outcomes. So what did we learn? Whoops, I forgot that comes up too quickly. So we learned that screaming is a great stimulus for audience attention. And we learned coincidentally that there were a number of effects for adult family members that are hard to measure, but worth the effort. And I just want to show you a couple of videos and have you be given the opportunity to speculate about what some of those adult outcomes may have been, and then I'll tell you about it. So here's just a couple of examples of families talking about their experiences.
Well, it started from really the time she was born. She was very difficult. She cried all the time. We thought she had colic. She would have temper tantrums that would last 45 minutes to an hour easily. Once Sam came, there was the jealousy that went along with that, and that's when it really became evident that there was a real problem, because she would hurt Sam, and it was very difficult.
We thought, we got to do something for her protection, for Sam's protection. It was things she shouldn't be doing. You shouldn't be hitting your parents. You shouldn't be running at them or scratching toward them or anything like that. 2 years ago, this wouldn't have ever been possible without RIP. Being able to support each other and know, and I think that brought us closer together as far as a marriage. We were working towards something together, and we saw our child responding, and we knew as parents we were doing the right thing because we were helping her long term.
It was worth the commitment. Once we were able to stop the temper tantrums, life became so much easier.
You have no idea. It's scary, to have a 5-year-old child that you don't know how to, you don't want to say control, but to help him to do the behaviors that are necessary and that's going to make a difference in life.
Number one, they taught me how to give directions. You want one of these? A rectangle?
Mommy, look.
Oh, I love that.
Like it.
And then they taught me how to really focus on the good things that he did. There's a definite difference. We communicate. I know how to communicate with him. And so it makes everything easier.
So I bet you can guess. So if you take the time and you measure family stress, pre and post, it basically the bottom drops out in terms of reducing levels of stress in the family. If you take the time to measure this variable that we think is really important, and that's insularity, and it's a fancy term for a real phenomenon, and that is that families of kids with challenging behavior tend to shrink their social world because when they go out in public, they get the diagnostic eye, like, what the hell are you doing in the supermarket? Can't you control your kid? And ultimately, that's a really horrific situation for adults, because as your social world shrinks, your supports shrink. And as your supports shrink, your ability to advocate and support for your child with special needs, in turn, is negatively impacted. And finally, when we measure parent self-efficacy, it greatly increases. And so, anyhow, just wanted to share that the effects are not just on child challenging behavior, but they're powerful impacts on adult family members. So, what did we learn over the last 47 years? And by the way, Matt and I are still working on this. We got a paper coming out shortly on more data from the RIP program. There are just 3 things I want to share with you out of dozens of learnings that I think are important and perhaps generalizable to a diverse audience like this. First of all, we learned that the world will not end if you remove all the diagnostic and all the administrative and all the procedural and all the stigmatizing barriers to service delivery. Contrary to popular belief, thousands and tens of thousands of people will not call up and say, I have a minor problem with my 3-year-old. Can I come 3 to 5 days a week for 3 hours a day and participate in RIP? That won't happen. What will happen is that families who need it will access service in a more timely and a more efficient fashion. The other thing that we learned is you don't necessarily need the most expensive, resource-rich program to affect positive short-term and long-term behavior change. And finally, we found out, somewhat by accident, through another OSEP-funded research project, as a matter of fact, that as family members move towards fidelity of this simple, at some level, straightforward behavioral intervention of differential reinforcement, yes, they need instrumental help. They need precise, evidence-based coaching to fidelity. But they also need emotional support, because we ask the question, who are the families who do best in RIP? That is, their child behavior improves most rapidly and they complete the entire intervention program and they complete payback. Who are they? Can we discriminate? You bet you can. And here is the only variable that predicts, and that is the primary adult in the family who's involved in RIP has somebody in their life, be it a spouse or a sister or an aunt or a friend, who says to them on a regular basis, I know how hard this is. You're doing a great job. I'm so proud of you. I can't believe the change in Phil's behavior. That made all the difference in the world in terms of who maintained, who was successful. And I would argue that this is not an effect that is specific to adult family members. I would argue that this is an effect that's true for teachers and paraeducators and anybody else who's working really hard, especially around children with challenging behavior. So, topic change. The next set of issues that my colleagues and I tackled occurred in the 1980s. There were a number of really wonderful studies that had been published looking at powerful effects for children with autism, but within limited scopes of development. So there were interventions to affect language, interventions to affect social skills, intervention to affect cognitive capabilities, but nobody having put them all together in a package to affect all of the defining characteristics of autism, and we tried to do that. Now, in the 1980s, there were all kinds of solutions, if you will, to the issue of early intervention for kids with autism. There was a lot of one-on-one instruction mediated by adults. There was a lot of focus on learning to learn. A lot of adult verbal behavior was something like, sit down, stand up, look at me, hands in lap. The notion being that if you went through that stunningly non-functional sequence of skill acquisition, that functional skill acquisition in the future would go much more rapidly. Most people had developed service systems to get kids with autism ready for school and community inclusion, although none of those people ever published any data that that actually happened. And of course, those of you who are around remember the charge for 40 hours, as if somehow paying somebody or some group of somebodies to deliver 40 hours of service was going to be the magic bullet. So in examining most closely the things that we and others held most dear, what did we develop? It's something that we call LEAP Preschool, an inclusionary program for young kids with autism and their typically developing peers. And I had a lot of help along the way from Marilyn Hoyson and Bonnie Jamison, Linda Cardisco, our initial intervention team, most amazing teachers I have ever seen, even till today, and Howard Goldstein, Sam Odom, Diane Sonata, Frank Kohler, and Ted Bovey, who really helped specify the specific elements of LEAP in terms of scientific studies and their impact on various domains of performance. So what were the characteristics of LEAP that distinguish LEAP from the common solutions when we examined most closely? First of all, we abandoned the slavish, hope that doesn't sound too negative. Well, I don't care about that either. We abandoned the slavish adherence to one instructional model fits all. And instead, we borrowed from Ted Carr and Bob Cagle and Laura Schreibman and Andy Bondi, and have always used multiple evidence-based practices. Why? Because if you look at the autism literature, you'll see that not all evidence-based practices are created equal. There's a direct association between specific evidence-based practices and domains of performance that are most effectively impacted by that evidence-based practice. So if you're going to claim that you have an evidence-based program, it better have multiple evidence-based practices as a part of it. After about 2 years of operation, we gave up spending a lot of money and time assessing kids to find out where we should start teaching, because we chronically underestimated the performance of everyone. That was not a good message for us as practitioners. Damn sure wasn't a good message to deliver to their adult family members. And so, since about 1982, how do we decide where we're going to begin teaching? We ask parents what they want. What outcomes are important to them? If we need to do a slight translation, we do it, but that's where we start instruction. We also begin inclusion from day one. And actually, to tell you the truth, it had nothing to do with inclusion. It had to do with utilizing, by far, the most effective evidence-based strategy to impact the core social relationship issue in autism. And that's using the influence of typically developing peers. So I want to show you a brief video of a day one with a child with autism and his typically developing peer. And we're not after any fancy, complex social interaction. But here's what we did. Before his first day, we did a reinforcer assessment. We found out his favorite thing was balls. We found out that his favorite thing to do with balls is to chuck them. And we said to ourselves, how do we start building a connection between Matthew and his peers? We'll make access to balls, and they're being thrown via a peer. And that's what you'll see in this video.
Pick up. Put down. Pick up.
Yes, good. Tell him you're picking up. Tell him he's doing it.
Matthew. Matthew. Matthew.
That's good trying.
Put in.
There, you did it, Matthew. Okay, tell him to walk up the stairs. Could he carry it up? Let's see if he could carry that up. Let's see if he can try that. Oh,
Go up the stairs by yourself.
that's
Go
great. That's right, Matthew. Walk up. That's right, Matthew. Yeah. Okay, you guys are ready to go. Oh, nice. Hand him one, Victoria.
Whoa. Whoa. Slow. Matthew, slow. Slow.
Uh-oh. Did he do it?
No,
Oh, tell him again.
slow it.
Throw it. There. Yes.
Slow it.
Good throwing.
Slow.
You may not be surprised when I tell you that all things being equal, females are better peer-mediated intervention agents than males. This is for two reasons. Females lie less. So if they say, let's play balls, that's what they'll do. Boys will say, let's play balls, and about 5 seconds later, they'll turn it into a drive-by ball shooting. And also, as you may have noticed, those of you who are into behavioral teaching strategies, females readily acquire the skill of implementing the system of least to most prompting. She did that twice, right? If you go back and think about it with the ball thing and with the going up the stairs. Carried up by yourself. That didn't work. She gives him this. That didn't work. And then, nope, right? Lays hands on, then he starts up. She backs off. Those of you who teach graduate students and have a hell of a time getting them to fluently implement system of least to most prompting, Victoria is available. I was tempted to nominate her as a CEC Teacher of the Year, but I wasn't sure people would take me seriously. People never take me seriously, but anyhow. So the other element of LEAP that was novel at the time is transdisciplinary service delivery. That means something really specific to us. That means if you walk into a well-functioning LEAP classroom, there's no way that you could identify, based upon the behavior of adults, who the lead teacher is, who the paraeducator is, who the regular ed teacher is, who the speech and language pathologist is. And that has nothing to do with being able to say, we do transdisciplinary. It has everything to do with generalization. It has everything to do with maximizing the number of opportunities to respond. The final thing that I would point out about the structure of LEAP is that we embed hundreds of learning opportunities across the day. Also, with a little money from our friends in Washington, D.C., we've even been able to identify what the right dosage is. So, for example, in the peer social interaction domain, we know if you embed about 100 peer social response opportunities across the day, that's a dosage, if you will, that leads to rapid and durable social behavior change. And we've done the same thing with other domains of performance and ask that really fundamental question, how much do you have to deliver, not just what you have to deliver. Whew, it's hot up here. What do you think? Yeah. It's freezing in the rest of this building. I turned off my air conditioner in the room when I got in about 4 o'clock yesterday, and at 10 p.m., it was still 61 degrees. I'm not complaining. Well, yeah, I am. But. So, like RIP, LEAP was wildly receptive. I mean, the opinions of our peers were just so heartwarming, I can't tell you. My favorite one is the first. This was written by the president of the largest autism group in the world when they found out that OSEP had funded the initial model demonstration program. Thank goodness the funding wasn't pulled based upon that letter. I never really quite got the imagery. You know, the language is flowery, but I kind of think of it more like a dandelion than a dahlia. A little more like a weed. It's potentially harmful to normal children and a waste of time for autistic individuals. That was from our NIMH grant application. And as a consequence, we wasted a lot of your federal tax dollars in the late 80s and early 90s, demonstrating that typically developing children did not catch autism from this experience. And then my favorite, obviously you can't have autism and get these kinds of results. Well, here are the results. And what we know is that if our training and technical assistance team has 2 years with a program where we provide intensive coaching to fidelity using our LEAP fidelity measure, the Quality Program Index, we can get these kinds of effects. Not with everybody. These are kind of, if you will, average outcomes. Some kids do better. Some kids don't. But we know on average we get about 2 months developmental progress across all developmental domains for each month that kids are enrolled. We see typical levels of peer social interaction after 2 years of enrollment, and we think 2 years is the right measured in time overall LEAP dosage. We see significant reductions in parent stress, in insularity that I talked about earlier, and in depression. In fact, in our initial set of cohort of families, we found 1/3 of the adults scored in the clinical range on the Beck Depression Inventory when they initially enrolled their kids in the LEAP program, and found without psychotherapy and medication significant changes over time in that measure. And depending upon the cohort of kids that we've studied, we found that intervention effects maintain for 4 to up to 12 years. So, briefly, what did we learn over the last 36 years? Well, first of all, we've learned that not only do typically developing kids not develop autism, but they seem to be inoculated from developing negative stereotypes about people with special needs. Here's the deal. If you show typically developing 3, 4, and 5-year-olds videos of children who aren't successful putting a puzzle together, and that individual has been labeled as not like you, the primary theme you get is they should be punished. How about that? Hold that in your mind for a moment. By comparison, the typically developing kids after 1 year in LEAP, when they see a video of a child not being successful, the child has been labeled as not like you, their primary theme that they produce is, if I had about 5 minutes, I could have taught her how to do that. Those are 2 fundamentally different worlds to grow up in, are they not? When people don't see you at your best, they say, you should be punished, versus, I got your back. I can teach you how to do that. The other thing that we found is that children with autism are exquisitely sensitive to the environments that they are placed in. So we recently completed a 4-year follow-up study of children who were in a randomized trial of the LEAP program. And we generally found that there was sustained effects between graduates of LEAP versus graduates of other inclusionary programs for kids with autism, but who did not do the LEAP model. But we thought to ourselves, well, these effects are not nearly as strong or different as the effects obtained during preschool. What's going on? And here's part of the answer to what is going on. We had a lot of kids in this study, almost 300 kids with autism. And so we were able to do this. We were able to find 20 pairs of kids who were matched, if you will, at the end of preschool on every measure that we had: autism symptoms, language competence, cognitive abilities, adaptive behavior. They essentially mirror one another. As it so happened, one member of each pair of 20 went to a school district program at kindergarten that was integrated. And they stayed in integrated services and inclusionary services through the end of 3rd grade, which are these data. And one member of that matched pair happened to have gone into a developmentally segregated kindergarten and stayed in that placement. And so if you look at the data from the Kaufman Achievement Test, the Test of Oral Language Development, the Leiter, and the Vineland, you're observing here really big differences. And these are scale scores where on the Kaufman, 100 is grade level performance. And on the other measures, 100 is age level performance. And that's why we suggest that inclusion for young kids with autism is not just a preschool thing. It should be instead considered just a launch point. Well, thank you. The other thing we learned is there's a long, hard road to reaching fidelity. Those of you who are in the personnel prep business at whatever level, providing technical assistance or training graduate students or whomever, might find this of interest. So here's the idea that we originally had in our work. And it's represented by this chart. And this chart is a lie. And the chart suggests that as adults get better at doing a complex intervention, child behavior will improve along the way, almost in kind of a linear relationship. And then the follow-up to that is that those improvements in child behavior will, if you will, excuse the term, reinforce adult behavior. Turns out not to be true, at least not in our data set. Here's what the real story is. Adults have to work their tails off and essentially get to fidelity before child behavior change occurs. That implies to me a real different system and intensity of support for adults as they move towards fidelity. And we also learned that hours of service delivery is not the magic bullet. It's the magic bullet if you're an attorney in terms of increasing your pocketbook, suing school districts for more hours that people are paid to provide service. But as it turns out, the equation for producing significant behavior change is much more complex. Let me give you the actual behavioral translation, first of all, in terms of hours. It's opportunities to respond. But just having a massive number of opportunities to respond is not going to yield, predictably, good outcomes, because it also makes a difference, does it not, what the functionality of those outcomes is or are. Right? I can teach you a bunch of stupid stuff, give you a lot of opportunities to practice meaningless tasks, or I can give you opportunities to engage in behaviors that's going to expand your circle of friends and support. Those are real different. But that's not enough either. You need to select an evidence-based practice, but then you also have to deliver it to fidelity. Makes no difference if you don't, as far as I can tell, with this population. It also makes a difference whether or not you impact the entire, our term, see if it fits for you, social ecology of the child. And what by that I mean you have to change the probability that adults who are paid are using evidence-based practices. You have to change the probability that parents are utilizing evidence-based practices. And yes, you have to change the probability that other young children in proximity to those kids are engaged in evidence-based practice as well. When all of those come together, you've changed the child's entire social ecology. It changes the equation. And you have to pay attention to generalization, not as an afterthought to acquiring some skill. We like to think as follows, that the problem of kids with autism is not in acquiring skills. We see kids with autism acquiring all kinds of behaviors in one or two opportunities. It may not be the skills that you're interested in they're acquiring, but what they really have problems with is the appropriate generalization, the utilization of skills at the right time, in the right context, with the right individuals. And of course, there is the social validity. It's important as well that significant adults in the child's life perceives a change independent of a statistical test. When all of those things are in place, we think that's the formula for good outcomes. Notice also, what kind of equation is this? Audience opportunity response. It's a multiplication. And, taking you back to third grade, baby, when any factor in a multiplication equation equals 0, the sum, nada. You got it. So that's what we think the real formula is. So, in the time I have remaining, and I don't wear a watch. I stopped wearing a watch in the 1960s because I thought it'd be cool to say, when somebody asked me, what time is it? My response would be, dude, I'm not into time. Well, I'm glad to see that still works, and 5 decades later. So what I'd like to suggest to you is that longitudinal programmatic work like RIP and LEAP is essentially impossible today. Why? Some of you who remember the 1990s remember something called streamlining government. Who could argue with streamlining government? One of the consequences of streamlining government was that special education research got moved from special education service delivery and technical assistance and model development and personnel preparation. That's not the important thing. What really got removed is the reciprocal influence that research and all those other elements, I would argue, should have on each other. Now, when some old codger like myself starts talking about the good old days, I know there's a great temptation to think, this is another sour grapes, get off my lawn kind of speech. Let me just say that I've probably profited more than most people on the planet from the current way research gets done. This is not sour grapes on my part. I'm just saying I think I did better a long time ago, and I think we can do better in the future. So what happened? Well, with apologies to the Greek Orthodox Church, we started worshiping at the altar of randomized controlled trials. Huge applause for the Greek Orthodox Church. All right. Yeah. And we fell under the audience reinforcement control and stimulus control of considering randomized controlled trials the sine qua non of special education research. I got no problems with randomized control trials and the necessity for maximizing internal validity. But religious zealotry, I would argue, can be a dangerous thing. And so what have the consequences been? Well, here's what I think the consequences have been. And this is Phil engaging in self-criticism. If you want to take it upon yourself, you're welcome to, or not. But I think we've lost the heart and soul of a lot of special education research, which was driven by individualization. I remember a time when I published studies and every outcome index was different because every individual in that study was different. I remember a time when I did research and every independent variable was titrated to the individual, and I didn't try to hide it, and I wasn't embarrassed by it. I remember a time where we even made decisions like who the intervention agent was going to be, where the intervention was going to take place, based upon the individual need. That's a problem. That's an issue that can get lost in certain kinds of research designs. I think we've also lost touch with a lot of educational reality around scale-up and sustainability. I believe we have enough evidence-based practices in terms of what we know about intervention, what we know about personnel preparation, what we know about technical assistance. What we don't have is enough practice-based evidence. That's different. Practice-based evidence is asking the question, under what conditions, with what supports, with what knowledge do people seek out, adopt, sustain, with money, but also with time and attention, evidence-based practices. And when I go around to a school administrator and I say, listen, I'm doing a study on coaching to fidelity, and what I want you to do is I want you to help me find one teacher in one classroom to implement this in one school to guard against some boogeyman around internal validity. They look at me like I'm insane. Well, I hope I'm not, but I'm proposing something that's insane in terms of what administrators want. No administrator would say, I want to adopt an evidence-based practice and I want to use it with one teacher in one classroom in one school, right? That's what I mean about potentially losing contact with educational reality around scale-up and sustainability. And finally, we started doing research in a box, especially around the search for evidence-based practices. And if you don't like research in a box, try the paint by numbers analogy. So if you filled in these boxes with the right colors, matched to the numbers, you would produce something that looked like flowers. None of you would mistake this for a Monet, would you? And I worry that a lot of our contemporary research, none of us would mistake it for a Monet-like piece of new science. Well, what are the boxes? Well, we can look at extant data. We can develop an intervention. We can test an intervention. We can scale up an intervention. But the caveat is we have to do those in a certain predefined way. Well, what's the problem with doing research in boxes? I'll tell you what the problem is. It defies 30 years of research on how we know scientific knowledge is advanced. And I don't think there's any counterfactuals to the items on this slide. So what do we know about advancing scientific research? Well, you know that you have to have a funding mechanism that directly reinforces and prompts independent, novel, critical thinking about a problem. Does research in a box do that? I worry that that's not true. It supports new methods being tried, new methods for assessment, new methods for data analysis, new methods for experimental designs. It encourages cross-disciplinary work. I don't see that anywhere. And I don't mean cross-disciplinary about the disciplines within special ed. I mean way cross-disciplinary, across the street disciplinary. And there has to be a long-term strategy applied around investment. Let me give you an example. If we decide as a country that we want children with special needs to be literate, that can't be a 2017 research priority. It has to be 2017 to perhaps 2040. There has to be a longitudinal mentality around the development of scientific knowledge. So, Renee gave me 32 days approximately to prepare this keynote. And so my excuse is that this little study is flawed because of Renee's timeline. But I decided, let's do something crazy and actually do some research around the good old days versus research in a box. So here's what I did. I asked my staff, their mean age is 34. That's relevant, actually. To tell me, there are 8 of them, to tell me if they had to choose, give me 5 strategies. You only have 5 strategies to use to instruct young children with special needs. What would those 5 strategies be? Together, those 8 people came up with 12 strategies. The list starts to appear on the left side of the slide. I then asked 2 other folks in another program at the university to do the following. And we got reliability, of course, between the 2 of them of 100%. I love it when that happens. And I said, find the earliest study documenting the effects of this intervention, right? And so then we were able to discriminate whether this intervention strategy was developed during the good old days, that's dog spelled backwards, or within the context of research in a box. Now, you may argue these are not my practices that I would choose. That's fine. But I would invite you to maybe do the same test yourself and see where it falls out. So here's the data. Parent-mediated intervention, God. Family-focused intervention, God. Child-initiated learning, embedded instruction, prompting hierarchies. So you're seeing a pattern here? Task analysis, use of functional assessment, database decision-making. Yep. Social stories, authentic strength-based assessment, use of feedback, and consequences. I would suggest to you that this is not an accident. I would suggest to you that the reason that this chart got filled in the way it got filled in is that there was a time when there was a direct association between research and the ascendancy of the individual, and research in special ed, and technical assistance in special ed, and model demonstration in special ed, personnel preparation, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to end by telling you that I'm not a bigot. I'm not anti-box. I regularly utilize this box at John Holly's Chinese restaurant, South Downing Street in Denver, Colorado. Okay? I'm not opposed, assuming that there is no collateral damage, with drone drops of cool things in boxes. I even, come on now, like these things in boxes, although I've cut down. I like these things in boxes. I like to give them. And probably my all-time favorite is popcorn in a box. I just don't think we need more of this. Science in a box. So, I don't want you to think, well, I'll tell you what I do want you to think. I do want you to think that I think it's okay to go back to an investigator-driven sort of model for special education research funding. But investigator-initiated doesn't mean that there are no government priorities. I'm not suggesting that. But the question before us might be, who sets the priorities? Who's involved in the setting of them? Oh, wait a minute. That was my presentation I gave to this meeting 30 years ago. Okay, here it comes. And I'm going to do this without my slide. So 30 years ago, I presented at the iteration of this conference. And one of the things that I had recently done, which is probably the reason I had to leave the state of Pennsylvania in a hurry, was I did this study, and we did surveys of about 300 families of young children with special needs from birth through age 8. And we gave them the chance to be in charge of research priorities. And we said, if you could decide, what would be the research that you would want, that would be valuable to you? And I think it's interesting to repeat this slide. I don't know if the data would be the same in 2016. I'm guessing it might be pretty close. So here's what they wanted. They wanted some research to help identify earlier on when children might be having an onset of learning problems or behavior problems, and therefore provide more timely intervention to occur. They want research that allows them to know the answer to the question, how long is it going to be before Phil can tell me what he wants? They want research that helps them effectively communicate with their children wants and needs and aversions and love and affection. They want help with lifespan kind of plans that allows them, not just their kids, allows them and their children to be independent and lead high-quality lives. They wanted research that made sure that their children are valued by other adults and, yes, by other children. And, man, they really hit it out of the park with this one. They wanted research to ensure a better continuity within and across years in terms of the behavior of adults who are paid to interact with their children. I don't know about you, I could live with that research agenda. I could better live with that than what we have today. So, I can't help it. I love symmetry. I want to end with another Rene Descartes. If you would be a real seeker after truth, it's necessary that at least once in your life you doubt, as far as possible, all things. But here's the caveat. Here's the important message that I hope you think about, not necessarily today or tomorrow, but at some point in time in the near future. Who better than you, this group, to examine most closely the things we hold to be most dear in the service of children and families with special needs. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the conference.